On a late summer morning in 1944, while maps curled at the edges on oak tables in East Prussia and the air smelled faintly of damp paper and cigarette ash, a circle of German officers convinced themselves that arithmetic would halt an army. They believed fuel gauges, ruined bridges, and the long drag of distance would do what their exhausted divisions could not. If you enjoy clear, story-driven military history that pulls apart those assumptions and shows how they collapsed under the weight of American improvisation and industrial power tap, subscribe now so you do not miss the next chapter. The tale opens with a certainty senior staff in the German headquarters argued that General George Patton had outrun his lifeline. Intelligence briefings laid out the picture as if it were destiny. General Alfred Jodl pored over reports that placed the spearheads roughly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, and the consensus was blunt. Logistics would not sustain the pace. German doctrine, hammered into generations of officers by campaign after campaign, underlined the same point in darker ink: armoured speed, starves without fuel. An armoured division gulped something like 150,000 gallons a day while attacking on roads more in bad ground. Rapid movement and empty tanks were the most predictable cause and effect in their vocabulary. The mathematics appeared merciless. Yet even as those calculations were being repeated like a catechism, reality was already pushing east with diesel breath. The Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from priority freight trains, had begun to move not as a normal convoy but as a rolling pipeline. Nearly 6,000 trucks surged forward day and night, hauling roughly 12,500 tons every 24 hours, in a formation that ignored blackouts, abandoned the delicate choreography of doctrine, and promised immediate operational shock. If the numbers on the map whispered halt, the numbers on the road shouted go. That surge did more than meet requirements. It erased assumptions. Within roughly 3 days, tanks that were supposed to be stranded rammed through positions on the Seine. About a week later, Paris was free. In roughly a month, the American advance pressed to the German border. What Germany's finest planners were about to learn to their astonishment and dread was that the engine of this miracle was not a single genius plan, but many tens of thousands of hands. The operation's beating heart was a corps of roughly 23,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers in a still segregated army, operating a one-way highway system that turned France into a living conveyor belt and forced German staff officers to confront both a military and a moral contradiction. The German expectation of an American logistical collapse did not come from ignorance, it came from their own experience. Germany had invented the vocabulary of modern mechanized warfare, and its most painful chapters taught hard limits. In Russia, momentum died not first from Soviet firepower, but from the plain inability to supply men and machines across vast distances and wrecked roads. Trucks shattered horse-drawn wagons. Still, the backbone of German transport lagged far behind steel spearheads, and mismatched railway gauges trapped mountains of supplies on the wrong side of the line. That history bred a prediction the Americans had lunged roughly 400 miles in about 30 days. What follows speed is paralysis. Machines mean fuel, ammunition, and parts. When the tail cannot keep the head fed, the head stops. German analysts took a pencil to Patton's order of battle and wrote verdicts in confident strokes. An infantry division ate roughly 700 tons a day. An armoured division needed roughly 1,000 tons. Patton wielded a dozen divisions spread across a front on the order of 60 miles. Multiply the daily requirement, add the state of French roads dynamited in retreat, compare the result to the distance from the beaches, and write the conclusion as if it were a law of physics. You cannot move that much, that far, that fast. But across the Channel and along the Norman roads, American logisticians were not solving algebra on paper. They were building a river. Their plan sounded like heresy to doctrinal ears and like common sense to truck drivers. Make the road itself the warehouse. Create a one-way highway from the ports to the front and keep it flowing nearly all day and all night. Run every vehicle 20 hours out of every 24 halt, only for fuel and true emergencies, and aim to push a minimum of 12,500 tons a day. Borrow the Red Ball idea from railroading and apply its ruthless priority to everything. Nothing yields to anything but this flow. That principle had sharp, simple teeth. Absolute priority meant no delays, no traditional peacetime niceties, no waiting for perfect coordination. Then came the specifications that offended German eyes that had been trained to respect darkness and dispersion. Establish 2 parallel one-way traffic streams, one for loaded trucks forward, one for empties back. Keep headlights on at night. Enforce a no-stop rule except for refueling or mechanical catastrophe. Dispatch convoys at roughly 5-minute intervals and hold an average of about 35 miles per hour. Position mobile maintenance teams every 50 miles. Station military police to pull out any vehicle that dropped below reasonable speed. It read like a checklist of doctrinal sins, and yet it was precisely those sins that produced the miracle. The needed scale mocked the textbooks. Roughly 140 truck companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles, and something close to 90% availability sounded like a fantasy even to American officers used to big numbers. And still within roughly a day and a half, the fantasy was humming. Drivers from quartermaster truck companies climbed into 2.5-ton workhorses loaded with artillery shells and roared toward the east. The demographic reality of the cab seats would have stunned. The men in black uniforms who wrote racial screeds around 3/4 of the drivers were black Americans barred from restaurants back home and from many combat roles. But now, powering the army every white general depended on. In hours they made a culture nicknaming their trucks, scrawling jokes and promises on the metal, and enforcing their own common-sense rules. Slow movers yielded. Broke trucks were shoved into ditches without ceremony. A driver below a practical speed was an obstruction, not a comrade to coddle. As this culture colonized the roads, German reconnaissance units peered from hedgerows and high ground and sent messages that sounded like warnings from another planet. They reported unbroken strings of headlights flickering to the horizon, for distances that beggared belief, counted vehicles per hour that their doctrine said should not exist in a contested theatre, and noted with disbelief that blackout discipline had been thrown overboard. Every principle of survivability, darkness, spacing, dispersion appeared to be violated, and yet the convoys rolled untouched. A panzer general watching from concealment confessed in his report that what he was seeing was not military science as they understood it. It was mass production harnessed to war. The Americans were playing a different game. Where German doctrine hoarded vehicles, the Americans planned for failure and made failure irrelevant. They expected breakdowns and wrote them into the tempo. They improvised as a habit rather than as an exception. They conserved nothing that slowed the flow. And the numbers piled up in a way that turned skepticism into fear. In the first week alone, the Red Ball Express moved something on the order of 90,000 tons, with trucks shuttling 1.5 trips a day over round trips of nearly 700 miles, gulping roughly 300,000 gallons, to keep the river moving. German analysts who captured fragments of these figures dismissed them as propaganda because their own arithmetic said they could not be real, and then the figures climbed further. By the 5th of September, the rhythm hardened into a drumbeat. Convoys pulled out every 5 minutes. An average convoy ran to roughly 67 vehicles. Loads per truck settled into a steady 5 tons, with heavier overloading not uncommon. One-way travel times hovered around 14 hours, turnarounds around 2 hours, and the road never truly slept. Along that road, innovation became a reflex. When a truck coughed, mobile mechanics triaged it on the shoulder. If the problem could not be solved in a quarter of an hour, the rig was dragged off and sacrificed for parts. Engines were swapped with the speed of a pit crew, sometimes in something like 3/4 of an hour using mobile cranes. Drivers sketched alternate paths when congestion appeared. They commandeered buses to carry people so that trucks could carry cargo. They repainted captured German vehicles and pressed them into service. Where bridges were gone, rubble became roadbed and bypasses sprouted like weeds after a storm. To German officers, it looked like chaos that ought to cannibalize itself. In practice, it built throughput. The element that most staggered German minds, however, was fuel, because American fuel management contradicted their most basic assumptions about scarcity. The Red Ball Express itself burned on the order of 300,000 gallons a day just to feed its own motion, which was more than many German formations received for all purposes. Yet fuel for the trucks and for the tanks never seemed to run short. Under the channel lay a system of underwater pipelines that German intelligence had failed even to detect pushing gasoline from British depots to French shores. And along the routes forward, fuel dumps sat at regular intervals, so that a truck did not idle long enough to make a line. Tankers ran their own parallel convoys. In the eyes of German aerial photo interpreters, the fuel picture looked like a nightmare. The Americans possessed forward dumps larger than German strategic reserves. They appeared to burn gasoline, moving gasoline, and still had more to burn. The result of such abundance was not simply sufficiency but multiplication. German doctrine taught that even in good conditions, armoured divisions could sustain about 20 to 30 miles of forward motion per day. Patton's formations, while fed by this moving river, pushed 40 to 60 miles per day for stretches that rolled into weeks. On one day that burned itself into German staff, notes the 4th Armoured Division threw itself forward roughly 35 miles by midday, took fuel and shells from waiting trucks, and then surged another 30-plus miles by nightfall. At first, some in East Prussia dismissed these tallies as misreads or lies. Then they intercepted American radio traffic that confirmed the pace, and what unnerved them even more was the casual way American units broadcast their positions. It sounded like open boasting. It smelled like a confidence that the German side could not punish in time even if they overheard it. By early September, German intelligence compiled thick summaries that pulled all of this into a single brutal picture. American logistics wasted vehicles as policy, writing off broken trucks without a second thought if that preserved flow. Drivers fueled themselves with stimulants, ran until they hallucinated, and still found the will to keep their foot down. Camouflage discipline evaporated because it cost minutes, and minutes were more valuable than paint or tarpaulins. Mechanical failure rates that would ruin a European army were drowned in redundancy. Field Marshal Walter Model read those pages, and if the testimony is to be believed, admitted to colleagues that they were not facing a superior tactical machine so much as a superior civilization, one that did not fear losing trucks because it had the factories to birth more. The American answer to attrition was not delicacy, it was multiplication. All of this came with human pain, and the ragged edges of fatigue, and the men in the cabs paid the price. Some drove for 3 days and nights with only brief collapses, some died in fog and fire and on broken shoulders, and all learned that purpose can sometimes carry a body farther than doctrine claims possible. But morale held in a way that shocked outside observers because the men knew they were making history with every downshift and every mile marker. Captured German officers, questioned in tents and stone rooms, expressed a disoriented respect that bordered on awe. They said the Americans broke the rules and still won, that they had industrialized war at a level beyond German comprehension, that they could bring to bear masses of materiel and motion that outgrew Clausewitzian diagrams. The soundscape itself became a weapon. German riflemen lay in fields and heard an endless hum, a drone on the night air that meant the Americans were being refilled while they themselves counted their last cartridges. Men began to speak of hearing trucks even when there were none, and American psychological operations teams learned to play recordings of engines toward the lines to deepen that despair. And all the while the river moved, and with it a redefinition of what was possible in modern war. Model's remark, spoken in a tone more weary than defiant, drew a line under the German dilemma. The American advantage was not tactical, it was civilizational. He saw in the relentless convoys the reflection of a society that did not fear loss because its reservoirs of fuel, steel, and labor were ocean deep. The Americans drove as if they had infinite second chances. Fearlessness was not only courage but the confidence of abundance, the knowledge that a broken truck would be replaced, a dead driver substituted a gallon, spilled merely replaced by 100 more. The old certainties of strategy, terrain, timing, the economy of force crumbled before that avalanche of industry. Germany, with its doctrines honed on scarcity, could not offset a civilization built on surplus. The human cost of that surplus was written in exhaustion and flame along the Red Ball route. Drivers sometimes stayed at the wheel for 72 consecutive hours, their eyes grainy, their minds slipping into the borderlands between dream and command. Some hallucinated road signs or phantom headlights. Accidents multiplied, trucks colliding in fog, tipping on cratered shoulders or catching fire when overheated engines met spilt fuel. Around 300 men died doing what most soldiers never considered combat. Yet morale did not collapse. Pride and purpose replaced comfort. They knew they were the artery through which victory flowed. When they looked at their mud-spattered hands, they saw not fatigue but proof that they were indispensable. Among the captured Germans, this recognition of defeat was clearest, not in their silence but in their words. Prisoners, when questioned, admitted that they had measured victory by tanks and guns, not by trucks and fuel cans. They had followed the rules of operational art, and the Americans had violated every one of them. Still, the Americans won. They achieved success by volume, by scale, by a mechanical audacity the German imagination could not stretch to comprehend. "You have industrialized warfare," one colonel said, "beyond the reach of our philosophy." It was not rhetoric, it was resignation. For men still fighting in the mud, the sound of those convoys became a weapon sharper than steel. German riflemen lay in their trenches and heard the night hum, with engines that never rested. The noise rolled over hills like the tide, an endless low thunder that said plainly the Americans have enough for everyone and more besides. It was the music of despair. Ammunition boxes on the German side sat almost empty, while across the fields came the mechanical roar of abundance. The mind broke before the body did. At the heart of that abundance was a piece of machinery that embodied the entire American method, the deuce and a half, the 2.5-ton GMC truck. More than 500,000 had been built by the time the war ended, a number so absurd that German quartermasters refused to believe it until they counted the wrecks. The truck came from the same idea that had built the nation's highways and assembly lines: make one design, make it reliable, make it by the 100,000. All-wheel drive came standard, not as a luxury. It could wade through 30 inches of water, swallow low-grade fuel without complaint, and keep its driver warm with a working heater, an accessory that German troops joked belonged to a peacetime dream. The American philosophy of maintenance was as shocking as their quantity. Where Germans disassembled and rebuilt, Americans replaced and rolled on. A blown engine was not a setback but a signal to swap. Cranes lifted old blocks and dropped new ones in less than an hour. The system preferred competence in thousands of mechanics over genius in a few. It was the democratization of repair, industrial pragmatism, turned into battlefield doctrine. That same adaptability extended to the geography of the supply system. When the first route strained under the flood of movement, new arteries appeared almost overnight. The White Ball Express, the Green Diamond, the Red Lion, and the ABC line from Antwerp to Brussels to Charleroi each came to life within 48 hours of conception. It took the Germans weeks to plan and staff an operation of similar size. The Americans painted fresh markers, handed out maps, and started the engines. The road network pulsed like a living organism. And within that organism, the contribution of African-American soldiers forced an ideological crisis for Nazi observers. A regime built on racial hierarchy watched black drivers and mechanics outthink obstacles that had defeated their own master race. These men loaded and balanced cargo faster than German engineers, improvised bridges, navigated bombed villages, and kept the flow running while artillery thundered miles away. Prisoners assigned as labourers on the Red Ball routes found themselves taking orders from black sergeants who spoke better English than their former officers and who treated them with fairness that propaganda had claimed impossible. Each truckload was a refutation of Hitler's science. Every convoy that reached the front was a moving argument against bigotry. Behind the drivers, engineers in steel helmets built the backbone that carried their weight. 40 bridges were constructed or reinforced while shells still whined overhead. 15 fuel depots rose from shattered villages. 26 maintenance stations and 8 temporary cities for rest and repair appeared along the way. When German sappers destroyed a bridge at Monte and predicted that it would take 6 weeks to replace, American engineers finished a functional crossing in 14 hours. Trucks detoured a handful of miles and never stopped running. Observers on the German side wrote in disbelief that the Americans built faster than they could destroy. There were no committee meetings, no elegant blueprints, just bulldozers and men who understood that speed itself was a weapon. Ammunition flowed in torrents that defied arithmetic. At Metz, in one 24-hour period, American artillery fired 100,000 rounds, every shell delivered on time and with surplus to spare. German guns nearby, rationed to 50 shells per piece per day, fell silent for lack of powder and shell. The Red Ball Express met a demand of roughly 50 truckloads of ammunition every hour, a feat that no European army of that era could have imagined. Attrition, which by any traditional metric should have ended the experiment, simply became another statistic absorbed by American industry. Around 30% of trucks were mechanically down at any given day, 10,000 tires wore out each week, and more than 5,000 vehicles were eventually destroyed or abandoned. Yet the flow of supplies did not slow. Ships arrived in French ports carrying new vehicles, drivers learned their jobs in 2 days, and the total transport capacity kept rising. Replacement was not an emergency measure, it was the design principle. For civilians along the roads, the sight of this endless motion rewired belief. Children who had grown up measuring bread in ounces saw drivers handing out chocolate cigarettes and soap. To them, the Americans seemed not merely liberators, but magicians who could conjure abundance from engines. German intelligence reports noted that morale in occupied regions flipped almost overnight. People whispered that American victory was not only certain but near. Resistance activity multiplied fourfold along the Red Ball routes. The sight of rolling generosity was its own propaganda. The convoy, however, approached its breaking point by early September. The Third Army had advanced so far that the round trip stretched roughly 700 miles. Drivers collapsed from fatigue, engines failed from overuse, and for the first time German analysts noted a change convoys now passed at 15-minute intervals instead of 5 speeds dipping noticeably. They prepared to exploit what they thought was the beginning of collapse. It never came. Within 72 hours, the Americans restructured the entire system. They created transfer points to cut individual driving distances in half, implemented crew rotations, built forward repair bases, and doubled the number of active trucks. By the 12th of September, delivery tonnage had not just recovered, it had increased. Even that was not the ceiling. When roads and vehicles could not satisfy every demand, the Americans turned the sky into another highway. C-47 transport aircraft, the same reliable workhorses that had dropped paratroopers in Normandy, began hauling supplies directly to the front. Each plane carried about 3 tons. On one day alone, 900 flights delivered roughly 2,700 tons, nearly 10 times what the German Luftwaffe had managed in its best effort at Stalingrad. The Americans treated the air as an extension of the road, not a separate domain. They accepted losses the way they accepted breakdowns, anticipated tolerable, irrelevant to the outcome. Equally alien to German eyes was the way command authority dissolved into trust. Decisions that in the Wehrmacht required a colonel's signature were made by lieutenants. Sergeants controlled operations the size of regiments. Decentralization, the very chaos that the Germans feared, turned out to be efficiency in another form. Everyone acted, no one waited. This freedom, tied to the security of limitless resupply, multiplied results faster than hierarchy could measure. By the time rail lines were rebuilt, the Red Ball Express had achieved its purpose and more. What was meant to run for 10 days continued for 82, delivering over 412,000 tons of supplies, proof that logistics had ceased to be a background service and had become the very strategy of the Placed 8 T-Mode campaign. Even while it operated, American railroad engineers restored roughly 1,000 miles of destroyed track, often laying new rails with captured German locomotives. As trains began to roll again, the highway system smoothly handed them the load, an industrial symphony that played without pause. When the final accounting arrived, the figures defied the imagination of the European staff rooms. At its peak, the operation used 7,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers, transporting millions of rations, mountains of medical supplies, and enough fuel and ammunition to feed an empire of steel. German officers held in captivity reviewed these records with the disbelief of mathematicians who discover their own equations have failed. They had assumed that multiplying their best logistical performance by 3 would approximate America's capacity. The result was tenfold greater. But beyond the tonnage tables, the Red Ball Express broke something deeper than statistics. It shattered the myth of German superiority. The same generals who had mocked Americans as soft and mechanized now faced the fact that these supposedly undisciplined men had built a system that outlasted and outproduced them. The nation of improvisers had defeated the nation of planners. Within the American army itself, the success reverberated far beyond fuel and steel. When General Dwight Eisenhower toured the Red Ball routes and saw black drivers who had been running for 20 straight hours, He told his aide that these men were winning the war as surely as any infantry. It was a quiet admission that the battlefield and the backline were won. The proof stood in dust and diesel, and it carried with it a question that the United States could no longer ignore. If these men could sustain an army abroad, what justification remained for segregation at home? That question would echo in the next decade. Meanwhile, in Germany, the racial theorists fell silent. Publications that once analyzed racial weakness stopped discussing American logistics altogether. The evidence was too crushing to twist into ideology. Instead, German military engineers began to study it with cold curiosity. Out of defeat came new doctrine. Quantity could outpace elegance. Redundancy could kill vulnerability. Decentralized execution could outperform rigid control. Standardization could outstrip specialization. And the limits of human endurance were far higher than textbooks admitted. The Red Ball Express had rewritten the physics of supply. Beneath these theories lay countless acts of individual heroism that made the statistics possible. There was the corporal who drove for 2 days without rest to deliver shells, fainting at the wheel and being revived by his comrades. There was the private who steered a truck already burning from the brakes for 2 miles to a field hospital, jumping free as it exploded, but saving the medical cargo that treated soldiers from both sides. Thousands more like them made the system something more than numbers on a chart. They embodied a culture that valued initiative above obedience, mission above rule, and motion above perfection. To the Germans watching from ruined farmhouses or from the prisoner pens that sprouted in France, it must have seemed like witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, a war fought not only by divisions and corps but by engines, roads, and an idea that if a nation could keep its trucks rolling day and night, there was no front that could stop it. The Red Ball Express proved that idea beyond argument. Under the steel-grey skies of late 1944, the Germans tried to imitate what they could not understand. Operation Greif, an ambitious attempt to use captured American trucks, uniforms, and equipment, was conceived as their answer to the Red Ball Express. But imitation without belief is hollow. The borrowed trucks, repainted with stolen stars, coughed and died within days. German mechanics trained for precision over improvisation could not maintain vehicles built for mass replacement rather than delicate repair. Their fuel stores, already strangled by Allied bombing, dried up before the plan could move from theory to practice. What the Germans lacked was not courage but culture, the American attitude that waste was acceptable if motion continued. Every lost truck was another lesson: you cannot mimic abundance when you live by scarcity. Then winter descended upon Europe like a sentence. Snow turned roads into white trenches, ice locked rivers, and logic said that wheels must stop. Yet the Red Ball Express refused to freeze. Drivers wrapped chains around their tires, poured alcohol and antifreeze into radiators, and kept their engines roaring against the cold. Convoy speeds dropped from 35 to 15 miles an hour, but the tonnage did not decline. Trucks crawled through blizzards that had stalled entire panzer divisions, their headlights cutting tunnels through the snow. German observers shivering in observation posts wrote reports of disbelief. The Americans are moving in weather that stops everything else. The river of supply had turned to ice, but it still flowed. When the war finally ended, captured German logisticians were asked to study what they had witnessed. Their conclusions read like confessions. They admitted that the Americans had not merely built a transport system, but had conjured temporary civilizations. Cities that existed only to feed armies with their own power, workshops, kitchens, and rules rising from empty fields, vanishing when no longer needed. They contrasted this with their own obsession with permanence barracks built to last decades, depots laid out with architectural precision. The Americans, they wrote, built for days and destroyed for progress. To them, impermanence had become a form of superiority. That impermanence solved the flaw that had haunted Blitzkrieg from the beginning. The Germans had invented the art of fast warfare, but had never solved the problem of keeping speed supplied. The Red Ball Express closed that circle. It turned industry into strategy, abundance into a weapon. American logistics was not elegant. It was a flood. It did not glide. It drowned obstacles. For the first time in modern warfare, an army advanced faster than its own consumption curve predicted possible. The Blitzkrieg had been tactical lightning. The Red Ball Express was industrial thunder. The costs were vast enough to make economists wince. Trucks burned, fuel poured, roads torn to shreds. The bill for the operation reached around $100 million. But in a war that cost the United States roughly $250 million every day, the arithmetic favored boldness. The Red Ball Express shortened the war by months, perhaps half a year. That meant 6 months fewer bombings, 6 months fewer burials, and hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers captured instead of still fighting. Measured against those outcomes, the extravagance was not waste, it was investment. When the convoys finally wound down, the men who had lived behind those steering wheels returned home with a new kind of expertise. Many were still young, barely 20, but they had operated what was at that time the largest and most complex transportation network in history. Back in civilian life, they turned that knowledge into an industry. They founded trucking companies, designed distribution systems, and sketched ideas for what would become the interstate highway system. Veterans of the Red Ball Express introduced the concept of 24-hour operation into peacetime commerce. American logistics after the war, the endless lines of freight trucks, the promise of delivery across a continent was the child of that wartime miracle. Historians would later sift through dispatches and tonnage charts and conclude that the Red Ball Express was not merely supportive but decisive. It validated an American doctrine that had often been mocked in European academies, that logistics, not tactics, wins modern wars. While the German staff read and reread the pages of Clausewitz, the Americans had studied Detroit. The assembly line had replaced the general's diagram. They fought with production schedules, and those schedules marched faster than any army. In the contest between precision and volume, volume had prevailed. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, reading intelligence summaries in the last autumn of the war, grasped what others still denied. He realized that distance no longer meant delay for the Americans. The culminating point, that moment when a force exhausts its ability to advance, had vanished. His own troops were still trained to think in miles of rail and wagons, but the enemy had rendered the map obsolete. The Americans, he said, were fighting the next war, while Germany was still perfecting the last one. Suggestions that the Luftwaffe might interdict the supply routes were fantasies on paper. The simple arithmetic was hopeless. The Americans fielded roughly 6,000 trucks. To make a dent, 200 of them would have to be destroyed every day. Germany no longer had 200 functioning aircraft, and even if it did, each destroyed truck would be replaced within a week. You cannot bomb an enemy who measures repair in hours and production in millions. Within the ranks of the Red Ball Express, exhaustion grew into legend. Men who had not slept for 3 days refused relief, arguing that their replacements did not know the road. Mechanics worked in freezing rain, hammering axles beneath dim lamps, while teenagers barely out of school coaxed wrecked engines back to life. It was a mythology of voluntary suffering, of men who pushed through misery without orders, driven by the idea that the line must not break. Some of them were motivated by pride, others by sheer stubbornness, and many by the unspoken knowledge that their contribution would never be honored on parade. But the road remembered them. The sound of that road became another weapon in the American arsenal. German units along the front began reporting phantom convoys, the low, rhythmic droning of engines that could be heard long after the trucks had passed. Sometimes there were no convoys at all. American psychological warfare units had begun broadcasting recorded engine noise toward German positions. Troops, worn thin and half-starved, reported entire columns that did not exist. The sound of supply had become the sound of inevitability. When the order finally came to shut down the operation, it was carried out with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized its birth. In 72 hours, the Red Ball Express demobilized routes, cleared vehicles, reassigned depots, emptied, and personnel sent elsewhere. The Germans, who took months to dismantle smaller operations, would later marvel that the Americans could dissolve a temporary empire without a trace. Agility, they concluded, was the final American weapon speed, not only in building, but in ending. For the officers who surrendered in the spring of 1945, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of inevitability. They spoke in interrogations of trying to fight an enemy whose supply lines outran their capacity to destroy. They called it a war against a factory. No defense, they admitted, existed against that kind of power. One general said simply, "You could supply armies faster than we could annihilate them." It was not exaggeration, but surrender phrased as logic. Even among Germany's most seasoned commanders, the revelation was humbling. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a strategist famous for his defensive skill, told his captors that what shocked him most was not American tanks or airplanes, but trucks. "You fought with your factories," he said, "and we fought with our soldiers." It was a sentence that condensed the truth of industrial warfare. The factory had become the new fortress, and production lines had replaced battalions as the arbiters of victory. The final statistics of the Red Ball Express read like a ledger from another world. More than 412,000 tons of cargo delivered, 122 million ton miles, travelled over 57 million, gallons of fuel consumed, and more than 5,000 vehicles lost or worn out beyond repair. Behind those figures lay an unspoken law of the modern age. When industry enters war, strategy follows production. Tactical brilliance, no matter how dazzling, bends to the arithmetic of supply. Decades later, recognition finally came. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the Red Ball Express. At the ceremony, veterans, many of them African American, stood in dress coats and remembered the nights when their headlights were the only stars that shone through European fog. They spoke quietly of the pride that had carried them, and of how long it had taken for the world to see their contribution. They had driven through discrimination at home and danger abroad, and they had delivered victory at 35 miles an hour. Their achievement embodied a deeper truth about the system they served. Industrial democracy, with all its waste and noise and endless argument, had out-mobilized totalitarian efficiency. 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons a day across 700 miles did more than silence skeptics. It proved that freedom could organize itself for war without losing its soul. While the German machine valued obedience and precision, the American machine thrived on initiative and excess. The empire of plenty overwhelmed the empire of control. The genius of the Red Ball Express did not rest in a single commander, but in the collective aptitude of thousands who made decisions from the bottom up. Where a German officer awaited permission, an American sergeant improvised. Where one army demanded perfection before action, the other acted first and fixed later. The result was a system whose intelligence was distributed, not centralized, an organism rather than a hierarchy. Its genius was systemic, not singular. General Patton, whose tanks had drunk the lifeblood of that system, understood the debt better than anyone. He wrote that the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for victory as any infantry regiment. Without them, he said, the Third Army would have stopped. Without movement, there could have been no victory. He acknowledged, too, the bitter irony that most of those drivers were black men serving in a segregated army that had not yet learned to value them as equals. History, he wrote, must remember that truth. The truth by then was visible on every road in liberated France. The decisive lesson of the Red Ball Express was simple: trucks beat tactics. When supply outruns physics, when endurance outpaces exhaustion, even the strongest opposition collapses. For 82 days, the Red Ball Express kept moving, and by the end of those 82 days, the laughter that had greeted American logistics in German headquarters had fallen silent. The Wehrmacht's tanks had been defeated by American trucks, its doctrine by American abundance, its pride by American improvisation. When the operation officially ended, its legacy continued to shape every army that studied it. The principle was clear and brutal in its simplicity: victory belongs to the side that can deliver the most supplies the fastest and the farthest. In May of 1945, the proof stood written in the ruins of Europe. Those 23,000 drivers who had averaged 35 miles an hour across a continent had rewritten the rules of war. They had turned strategy into supply and trucks into weapons. France still bore the physical scars of their passage: ruts gouged into rural roads, bridges hastily rebuilt, and the skeletons of trucks left rusting in ditches. But the greater monument was invisible: the time they had stolen from the war, the lives they had saved by speeding its end. Professional soldiers would later quote an old saying: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. After the Red Ball Express, another line was added quietly in American circles, and Americans talk trucks. The roar of 6,000 engines had become the national language of power spoken in diesel and dust. In the end, the Germans admitted what they had never imagined: They had prepared for everything: enemy, tanks, planes, ships, but not for a nation with more trucks than they had soldiers. Against that rolling arithmetic, even genius could not compete. The Red Ball Express turned supply into strategy, movement into momentum, and fuel into fate. One delivery at a time, it transformed the art of war into an act of industry. The German generals who had once laughed at American logistics stopped laughing forever, for by the time they understood, Patton's spearheads were already at their gates, carried forward by the greatest convoy of determination ever to thunder across Europe.